Welcome to the We Fucking Love Startups podcast. I'm your host, Troy Hammond, and on today's episode, we're chatting with Joel Liza. Joel is the CTO of Trove, which is a fintech software application here in Wellington. We chat about lots of things from his American background to the 4 years that he spent at Netflix to what he's doing now. I hope you enjoy.
Kia ora. Thanks for tuning in to the We Fucking Love Startups podcast, brought to you by Talent Army.
I did a talk with, have you heard of Nextwork yet?
Nextwork?
Yeah, so I don't know much about it. There's a woman by the name of Amber Joseph who we needed a Salesforce certified kind of person, which is, I tend to tell people, I'm an atheist, but I think there might be a God, and she fucking hates me because Salesforce is everywhere I go. So we had to hire the Salesforce person. I'm like, I'm not even going to bother with these interview kind of things. So I went to a Salesforce meetup, found something online, and she was teaching certification for Salesforce people. So I went and kind of did a spiel, and we ended up hiring somebody, but I got to know this woman a little bit. Her name's Amber Joseph, and she works at this place called Nextwork, or she founded it or something like that.
Like a consultancy for Salesforce?
Yeah, it's a certification process for Salesforce, for AWS, for Azure, and it's basically, I really like data in terms of it's a great way to on-ramp, especially like women who are changing careers. They don't have a computer science degree. It's a really nice way to bring people into technology without having them get a 4-year degree. Same thing with Maori and underrepresented communities, which is something I've was a little bit more active in the States, and I'd like to get back into that.
Yeah, I remember us chatting about this over a beer last time.
Yeah. So I talked to her because her company is essentially doing that. She's finding people who are either new graduates or changing careers and getting them certified so that they're qualified to do jobs. Anyway, so I'm having a conversation with them, and I said, look, anytime I'm caught in one of these situations where I'm doing a talk, I said, there is, if I'm going to appeal to everybody, I'm probably not saying anything interesting. Like you really, and there's a study that was done, I can't remember where I read about it, but the study was, they were looking at dating apps. So whether that's, Grindr, Tinder, Harmony, or any of those things, and figuring out who's getting the most swipes or the most likes or the most whatevers. And it turns out, probably not surprisingly, that the people who get the most likes are like Hollywood good looking, right? Like, George Clooney's not struggling. Yeah, Troy, George Clooney.
That's the reason why I didn't get many likes.
Those folks are not struggling. What's surprising is what gets the second most likes isn't that next level down from Hollywood good looking. It's bright green hair and like bunch of, facial piercings. Like you have to go to the far extreme, because then you're going to find people who either really like it or really don't. If you really like somebody who has bright pink hair and 15 piercings on their face, like you find that attractive. Yeah. And what I was saying to Nextwork and to Amber's group was, I want to have that be my conversation here. Like, I'm not going to appeal to everybody in this room, but I'm going to have some honest conversations. And for the, let's say 30% who get something out of it, hopefully you get something really valuable out of it. And I don't walk away with a whole bunch of people that went, yeah, he was fine.
Yeah. Unmemorable, right? And so that's the reason why, I've always been myself, like online when I present, I'm just unauthentically myself. And I always, I posted this on LinkedIn the other day. So a friend came up to me and he was like, I need to talk about something, mate. He goes, I was in a chat with someone the other day and he goes, look, unfortunately someone said, that Troy Hammond guy, he's a bit like Marmite. You either love him or you hate him. And he was like, I just thought I'd let you know. And I was like, awesome, man. I was like, that's fucking perfect. That's what I want to hear. And I said, the only thing that makes me sad is that they didn't say Vegemite instead of Marmite, right? And he was like, what do you mean? And I was like, that's because I'm unauthentically myself. And so I cannot be liked universally across the board. And if I am, I'm a politician trying to pull the wool over your eyes, right? And
that's perfect.
Yeah, and so whenever I do talks, whenever I do anything, I always say, half of you are going to resonate with this, half of you probably won't. Yeah. That's fine. That's great. Let's let's walk away. And if nothing else, that you didn't like my talk or you didn't like me, but you say you made me think. I'm like, that's me. For me is like gold, right? Just to be able to have a conversation in this world that we live in now, right? And get someone to say, I'm going to think about that, is fantastic.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah. I mean, you and I had a conversation a little bit around some of the tall poppy stuff and some of that. And I think that like when I walked away from that conversation, that really resonated, not because, and I do agree wholeheartedly with you, but because it was a conversation that we could have in which I know there's probably a bunch of other people in the pub who weren't, who wouldn't have agreed with that.
Yeah.
I have a belief in terms of how to tip the scales to become really effective at your career. Like, how do you become really, really good at engineering or accounting or whatever it is? And while I don't necessarily subscribe to this idea of like 10,000 hours to become an expert in something, there is something to putting in the hard yards of being able to develop those deep skills. And when you are 21 years old coming out of uni, you have a different level of mental and physical strength. That you're the kind of person who can go out to the pubs until 2 a.m. and get up and still make it to work the next day. Now, you actually can tip the scales in your favor by putting more time in.
Yeah.
My wife, every time I make this argument, she's just like, I hate it. I absolutely hate when you say that. And I think part of it is she is reinventing herself now. Like, she's in university, and I think she's looking at it and being like, I'm mid-40s, and this idea that I'm going to have to tip the scales isn't very attractive. But there's something to it. There is something to putting that time in.
Obviously, you're American, right? From your accent. Well, people might not know that.
Fault.
Yeah, they might say Canadian, American, I don't know, right? The culture in America versus the culture in New Zealand is really different, right? And I think you would have noticed when you came here the shock. There is something about like Americans to me just seem more confident. They are like the natural orators. They're really niche, about their sort of subject matter, and they know it and they speak it really well. Is that because do you think that they get deep on what they know and they know well and they're really confident about it, or?
That's a really good question. Number one, I think Americans just have this, like we all are faking it, right?
Yeah.
Like we're all pushing
everyone's
ourselves.
faking it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think it's important, one, that when you're talking to somebody like yourself who is influential within the community, that like we're able to be really vulnerable about those things and be able to be really honest about it and just say, fuck man, I don't know what I'm doing half the time either. It sucks. But I think Americans do a better job of looking past that and kind of fake it until they make it into it. But I also feel like there is something that Americans are just like beat into them, and maybe not beat into them, but we're just almost born with it in that metaphor. Here's an example. Americans are up in arms about people getting taxed after they earn $5 million a year, whatever it is. Somewhere in the back of their heads, they all feel like they're about to become Elon Musk.
Yeah.
Right? Like, and I do that too. I am, I'm not afraid to be taxed. Like, I'm more of a socialist than anybody in my family is. But at the same time, I'm also on the cusp of doing something amazing.
Yeah.
And that, like, I'm 50 years old and I'm on the cusp of doing something amazing. What is it? I have no idea.
But you've got that innate confidence.
Yeah. And I think there's something about that, and I don't know how to really teach it. Now I've got kids in New Zealand, and I don't want them to lose that. I don't want them to lose that belief that if they just work a little bit harder or just keep pounding away at it, that something is going to come.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of is when I talked to you at the bar that night about that, that's where I really felt like that resonated with you, because we were talking about the tall poppy and some of those things, and that old saying, if it takes a community to raise a child, it takes a community to raise a business. And when we build really high-performing businesses that do well, we lift communities up. And there's something really, really valuable about that. And I think Kiwis as a whole, it's great that we are conscious of arrogance and some of those things, but it's also really important that we come together and we see that the things that we are trying to do, the dreams that we're trying to pursue, need to be supported, even if we don't always get it. And I think those failures are just as important as the successes are. I know
100%. So when I set up telling, I mean, even before, right, I was an active member in an online Facebook group that was largely Americans, North Americans, and I learned so much because I could jump on there and ask questions. Everyone would give me advice. They would rep me and like, you can do this, man. Just go for it. 100% behind you. And I could ask them any question at any time, and they would give me, yep, and then and do this and push forward, right? And so I felt like enabled by this community. I felt like I had an amazing, I think it was like 10,000 people in there, 10,000 cheerleaders of me doing this thing that I wanted to do, right?
Yeah.
The only time I didn't was when I said, hey, I'm going to swear. And they're like, oh, probably don't do that.
Right.
But and then I tried the same thing in New Zealand with the community here with their like recruitment meetups, and everyone was like, nah, I don't want to go to that. Like I don't want, because you're probably just going to headhunt my staff. And I'm just like, no, I'm trying to build a platform where we can all get together and share ideas, and just didn't go down. I think the max we ever got was like 50 people one night. I couldn't get it, but the Americans, man, you guys are like just 100%, go for it and support each other, and
Yeah, well, I mean, my own background, we'll make it about me, but my own background is...
Well, this is your podcast.
I have a completely unremarkable upbringing. There was absolutely nothing to it, to a point of I struggled to get into one of the worst universities, and in the little tiny state that I was from, and backed into my first job. Like I was bartending, and a regular came up to me and said, hey, Mike, this is Joel. He needs an internship. And Mike said, yeah, come on in on Monday. Like, had no idea what the company did. And
what did you study comp science, or did you?
I studied information systems.
Yeah.
So I took about 6.5 years to get about a 3.5-year degree, got it in information systems. I started kind of in statistics, and then I bounced around a little bit and did some economics and like played with English and just like a whole bunch of different stuff, and then landed in information systems. Had a professor that I really, really liked. He sat down and he's like, all right, so this weekend it's the Badgers versus the Gophers. It's 3.5. Like, and he like really put it into sports betting terms. And I was like, ooh, I like this. Where is this headed? And it just kind of fit. So just squeaked through it. And by that time I was working, 40, 45 hours a week, and just limped over the finish line. Finally got a degree for it. But I was already working in the job. Yeah. And, I put that time in to be effective at it. And I found myself in my first really high performing team. And I didn't know it at the time.
When you were in the internship?
So I was in my internship. And this regular who had come in, brilliant. I didn't know him from Adam. But as soon as he kind of got in front of a whiteboard, like light bulbs started to go off. Like, this guy, I can learn from this guy. And I put the hard yards in with a really, really strong team there. And kind of worked my way up, and I was building individual and household consolidation processes, this is back in like 96, maybe, somewhere in that region. And the company that I was working for had an NCOA license, and there was only like 5 of them in the United States. And NCOA is National Change of Address. Yeah. So the post office had it, and then a couple of credit bureaus and 2 companies. And this little rinky-dink company that I was at had one of these licenses.
So does that mean that you could go onto this place and change your address? Is that what it
meant? It meant that you could follow people around. So when John Smith in Portland, Oregon moved to Minneapolis, Minnesota, you could tell that it was the same person.
Okay, got it. Yeah.
That becomes really, really attractive for things like credit cards. Yeah. Some kind of ugly stuff, but also a lot of things. Yeah, and also a lot of things with banks.
Yep.
So I was building individual and household consolidation processes, which sounds really uninteresting, but is kind of complex, especially complex when you start to get like households of folks from Korea, where there's limited number of surnames, or I'm lived in New York for years, consider myself probably more New Yorker than anything else. Like, that area really fit my personality well. And you'll see like parts of Brooklyn are heavy Puerto Rican, and you'll end up with like 12 people that can live in a 2-bedroom apartment because it's a situation that they've found themselves in. So being able to pull those apart and say which Jose Guillermo Alejandro was the dad and which one was the son becomes kind of an interesting challenge. So I'm doing that. I'm writing SAS wrapped in IBM MBS JCL and an AS400, like a mainframe. I'm writing COBOL. I'm doing stuff that's horrible.
Kicks COBOL, you're really aging yourself here, man.
I know, right? I'm not painting a good picture.
Yeah.
So I back into this software application called ab initio, which is Latin for in the beginning. And this is a technology that came out of MIT, built by a bunch of folks who were they were trying to do artificial intelligence in like the 1980s, which didn't have the compute power to be able to do it. But they built this kind of one tool does everything software application called ab initio. And it's a super secretive company. Secretive enough that if you asked an employee at that time how many people work at the company, they would legitimately be unable to tell you at all how many people work there. Really, really secretive. Like
government
Steve
contractsy type.
Yeah, mostly they found their way in banking, health insurance, and like phones and that type of space where you had really big data back in the day. The secret sauce to it was on an individual server, they used the threads of the server to be able to do parallel processing before you had distributed systems that were widely used. So that became, I put the hard yards into it and got lucky enough to become pretty good in it and ended up becoming a consultant. So I became employee number one for this little tiny consultancy. Yeah. And then I moved to Chicago at that point and helped build out a data warehouse. So I like kind of backed into data warehousing. With a company called Crate and Barrel, which is like a retail. They sell like kind of upscale lamps and couches and that kind of home furniture.
I've seen them. Yeah.
Okay. I'm headquartered out of Chicago. At that point, then decided that I was going to try my hand in management. So I was managing at that point, and I had some really neat exposure to managing a multi-million-dollar project and managing teams and doing some of those things. And I decided I'm going to be a manager. Yeah. So I moved to North Carolina and hated it. Absolutely hated it. Just did not fit me at all. It was 700 degrees and racist. Like it just wasn't a good fit for me. So I moved up to New York City after that. So I moved back to New York. I had originally moved there in '98. Came back. Was working on Wall Street at Citi. Started my first company at that point. Yeah. And found myself to be pretty decent at that job. Parlayed that into an opportunity where Citi recognized that all of the code that they were writing, they were rewriting in Spanish for their banks that are in Spanish-speaking countries and French in France and so on. I don't know if Citi's actually in France, but you get the point. Yeah. So they said, well, could we write a program that essentially did metaprogramming? So if you wrote it all in English and I started to feed it another language, could it translate and write all the code itself? Which was really, really interesting. And I took that on, and then they had me go down to Buenos Aires for a few months and was kind of rolling it out there. Absolutely bombed. Yeah. So incredibly complex and just a complete failure. So I went back.
Sounds like a fantastic project to work.
Really fun.
I think all the biggest failures, right, are the most fun. Right? Yeah,
having a blast. Yeah. And plus, I was living in Buenos Aires. Right? Yeah. Oh, that's fantastic. So that didn't work out. Went back. I was back in New York, back at still at Citi, and they took that idea and they said, well, okay, so that didn't work out, but we are still writing the exact same code that every other bank needs to use. Everybody's making deposits. Everybody's making withdrawals. Like, why aren't we writing this once? And we could just sell it to all of our competitors. Our competitors are having the same struggles we are. And that was my introduction to white labeling. So I built this project, worked via Citi with Barclays to develop something that they would be able to use. And I got to a spot where I was feeling really, I guess there was two things. One, I was feeling confident in that I had become pretty good at my job. And the other one was, at this point, I had two kids under 2. Yeah. So you can imagine I'm in Brooklyn. Yeah. I'm going up and down subway stairs with a kid on my chest and a stroller. And just like, this is not working. So became really aware of Dunning-Kruger. You know, am I good at my job, or am I, good within the group that I'm at? And I said, oh, screw it. I'm going to go to Silicon Valley and see how that works out. So I quit my job. Flew my wife and at that point 2 kids to my mother-in-law's, and I took the dog, threw it in the car, and drove up to San Francisco. Found a place to stay there, and about a month later, Netflix called and said, "Do you want to have an interview. So I went in and met with. I mean, it's an impressive process. You have to meet with a lot of folks who are very impressive, and they really kind of make you take stock of yourself and put yourself out there.
How did scraping through your local university go, explaining that through the interview process?
They didn't care at all. Their biggest concern, I found out after I got the job, was I was overdressed for the interview.
Really?
That was their biggest thing. I don't know if the culture is going to, suit, button-down shirt, the kind of stuff that I wore on Wall Street, right? I had a button-down shirt and probably cufflinks because I wanted to look extra fancy for this job. Right?
Shiny shoes.
And they looked at me and were like, ooh, I don't know, this might not be a fit. But I met with a gentleman by the name of David Lenny, who ended up being my manager at one point. And he said, you have kids? I said, yeah. He said, you know how you cover up the outlets so that they don't stick their finger in it, and you put the soft corners on the tables so they don't fall and hit their face? I said, yeah, no, I'm doing all that stuff right now. And he said, that's the exact opposite of how we do it here. You are going to have production access to everything, and we're going to trust that you're going to, be able to find your way through it. And if you're not, and I was just like, oh, please. And the biggest thing that I found out there was that culture, while the Netflix culture deck is something that everybody's kind of is known, culture isn't developed with decks and with plans. Cultures reflect the founders.
Yeah.
And the Netflix culture deck had two things that it did. One, it reflected Reed Hastings, Mark Rudolph, and Patty McCord, and the authors of it. It reflected them.
Yeah.
And the second thing is that culture deck was never about attracting people. It's about turning the wrong people away.
Yeah.
And I think that has always really stuck with me. And every time I have been in organizations where all right, let's fix the culture, or let's do something with the culture, I always come back to that. This reflects the founders.
Yeah.
And I think that can become problematic. And it's one of the reasons that I am always reluctant to join organizations that have multiple founders, is because if you have two of them, it's more than twice as hard to get that right. And if you have a third, it's exponentially harder. Eventually, you all kind of grow differently. So I'm at Netflix. I'm there for about 4 years. Ended up doing a bunch of stuff with their A/B testing, their experimentation framework. Built out a bunch of stuff in their data science and engineering organization. Ended up being, I think, the fourth longest tenured person out of 75 folks in our organization. And got to a spot where my oldest was getting ready to go to kindy, and we kind of felt like it was our last best chance to move abroad.
Yeah.
4 years in Netflix, Silicon Valley, it's a long time. It's
8
pretty
years
intense.
in normal life.
Yeah. So had an opportunity to go to Sydney and work for Commonwealth Bank.
Which bank?
CBA.
Oh, that's an Aussie joke that you didn't get. That used to be the Commonwealth Bank's branding.
Bank.
Which bank? Commonwealth Bank.
Oh, no, I didn't get that. No, I didn't last there long enough. So I went over there, spent a year. Sydney's gorgeous, an absolutely beautiful city. CBA is a bank. And that was a really hard transition for me to go from Netflix, Silicon Valley into CBA. So I spent a year there. Started to look for a startup community in Sydney, and I'm sure it exists, but I didn't find it.
It didn't really back then, right? Back then, it's probably only the last 4 years that Sydney's really come on. It was always in Melbourne and other places, but Sydney was always just top corporates.
Yeah, and that was the experience I was having there. So Nike called one day and they said, hey, we're going to implement the Netflix OSS. Know you've been a part of some of that stuff. Because remember, I was at Netflix when we went from the red envelopes to streaming, and also when we went from on-prem to the cloud, right? So this is back 2010, 2011. So I got a lot of exposure to AWS at that point, was really surrounded by some really intelligent people who were doing some really amazing stuff. And so Nike was going to implement the Netflix OSS and, sent me all of their marketing stuff. And I mean, it's Nike, right? The marketing stuff is amazing. The campus is incredible. It had multiple soccer fields and basketball courts, and to go into the Michael Jordan building and just see all of his stuff and Bojack. It was really cool. The thing with Nike that I struggled with, and a lot of people love it, what I struggled with there was They have a huge lead over the number 2, and the number 2 is not Adidas, it's Under Armour. So they have a massive lead globally, and when organizations have that big of a lead, it's difficult to do innovation.
Because they're so scared of losing their number 1 spot, right? And so,
that's exactly right.
Yeah.
Like, what would be the upside of this? Hey, you're trying to introduce ephemeral EMR clusters. We're running on, already being like big databases. Why can't we just spend more on it? And I'm like, you don't have to. Like, why would you want to? You don't have to. And they're like, what's the risk? So I did that for a while, and like I said, a lot of people like that. It wasn't my thing, so I broke off and founded another company. And this one was helping organizations build like modern data and analytics stacks, and started working with a company called Grubhub, which is a food delivery organization in the States, and did some interesting stuff there. And then eventually I brought a CEO on so we could expand a little bit, and I could focus on the tech side and he could focus on all the other stuff, kind of a thing. And I had a little bit of success with that. And then somehow our Venn diagrams had a different overlap. And it was this guy who had contracts with like Foster Farms and did things like turkeys and poultry and stuff like that. And he put us in touch with this bio firm that was monitoring like chicken shit to find out if you had to recall food that had gone bad. Like, we found
by testing the chicken shit.
Yeah. So I built a product that they could, get some data and some visualizations out of, and off we go. And that became another product that we were doing. And so at this point, we've got this organization that I think peaked at, 10 or 12 people that now has a little bit of a dual personality. Yeah. We're doing products, but we also like do this kind of consulting.
I think that's the constant battle with any consulting company, right? They're constantly always got this little product there, and they're always like, every day, should we be a product company or a consulting company?
Yep. And the CEO that I had brought on, probably rightfully, was leaning more towards, why don't we just stick with our core competencies here. At this point, I had discovered serverless and some of those things, and I was just hooked. So I wanted to build more and more and more products. I wanted to start taking it the other way. And I was in Portland, Oregon at the time, and legalized cannabis there, and saw an opportunity to kind of bring together I'm going to say this and I'm going to regret it because they're not the same thing, but conceptually the Netflix recommendation engine to weed, right? And so I was talking to a friend of mine one day who's very buttoned up, and he's all CEO, like that's all he ever does, CEO stuff. And he was talking about his mom, and he said, my mom's got cancer and she's in a lot of pain, and she wanted to have some painkillers, and she didn't want to smoke anything. She wanted to have some sort of an edible, and it was really just she wanted to sleep and just get through the pain. Yeah. So she's like, so I brought my 85-year-old mom to a dispensary, and I said, what do you think? And, I'm dealing with this bud tender who's
19 years old and high out of his brains.
Right, right. And
you got this one, man, it's real fuck you up.
Yeah. So I'm like, this is a problem that needs fixing. So I set about building out this recommendation engine where if you went into a dispensary, you could say, I have glaucoma, I want blueberry, I don't want to fall asleep, and I want it to be an edible. And it would cross-reference that against the inventory, and it would set you some recommendations. So you went in the back, and instead of being at the mercy of the 19-year-old, you could actually be in control of that relationship.
Yeah.
Cool. So product had, it made a lot of sense to me. So I throw myself into this thing and get it to a point where I'm ready to go. And I take it out, and the first couple people that I went and talked to in the dispensaries were like, I don't get it. And I was like, well, and I go through this whole thing again. And I said, on the back end of it, there's a whole suite that does like, it tells you, I almost did like basket analysis. You could say, if people are buying Fruit Loops, they also like, and that might help you to optimize your purchasing. And they're just like, no. So I made two huge mistakes with it. One is I didn't ask the customers or
Yeah.
the dispensaries what they wanted. And the other one, and therefore I put a bunch of the wrong time into this back-end analytics stack. The other big mistake I made was not appreciating the fact that while cannabis is legal at the state level in America, it's not federally legal.
Yeah.
Which means that the banks, you can't do any business in the banks because the banks are FDIC. They're federally insured, which in turn meant for me to make this product work, number one, I would have to sell it to people who at this point were going, don't get it. And secondly, I was going to have to go door to door and pick up $99 a month from these random places in cash and then figure out what to do with it.
Yeah.
So I made some huge mistakes. Okay.
That sounds like a cool product, though. Like,
Thank
I'm
you.
not going to lie.
Appreciate that.
Yeah,
Appreciate that. So during all of this stuff, I get a call one time from a woman named Bethany Brodsky, who at that point has replaced Patty McCord as the chief talent officer at Netflix. And she calls me and she says, hey, I don't really know why, but there's this guy that we're going to do a restructure, and there's this guy who's not going to be part of the organization anymore. But he really reminds me of you. I think you should have a conversation with him. So I, sure, sounds good. Had a conversation. At this point, I'm hiring, could be a great possibility. It's clearly, she speaks highly of him and I respect the hell out of her. So this goes a long way. And I talked to this guy and he says, yeah, I don't know if I want to do the FANG thing anymore. Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google. He's like, I'm tired. He said, I'm going to go to New Zealand and I'm going to do the camper van thing for a couple of months, take my wife and kids, and we're going to do that. I'll call you when I get back. So he does that. He comes back and he says, took a job with Apple. I was like, oh, cool, man. That sounds fantastic. I love the company. But he says, I met this guy that you need to have a conversation with. His name is Ed.
Ed Baker.
Ed Baker, from Needles. He's a good human being. So I said, sure, I'll have a conversation with Ed, talk to Ed. And he and I have a lot of overlaps in terms of we both did a lot of data and analytics, kind of were in that big data space for a while.
Because Ed was like managing the data warehouse team for, who's the Call of Duty parent company? Activision, that's the one, out of Canada. Right.
Yeah, he was in Vancouver, if I'm not mistaken. So we had a good conversation. We had a lot of overlaps and just kind of left it at that. Hey, maybe someday we'll get to work together kind of a thing. Yeah. And I went back to doing my thing, and long about 6 months-ish later, some number of months later, there was a number of mass shootings. I mean, there always are. It's America. But there was 2 in a week, and I think it was Ohio and Texas. And America responded as we do. It's a God-given right. Thoughts and prayers. And we were just kind of at the end of that. Like, you can only do that so many times before you're like, this country, it just doesn't align with us anymore. And that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. So I called Ed, and Ed said, yeah, cool, I don't have anything for you, but you should talk to this guy I know. Yeah. And that's when I met you.
Yeah, I remember it. Ed introduced me as this crazy vegan hippie guy who was probably too tired to read the email, but if he does manage to read it, he's a decent recruiter. And I replied back with some bullshit thing saying, yeah, sorry, I'm barely got the energy to reply here. But, in desperate need of some meat, and you sent back a whole pictures of meat.
I forgot about this.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, that's funny.
But yeah, man, I liked you instantly just from that reply because I meet a lot of Americans who want to move to New Zealand, and I have to sit them down over a video chat and say, all right, let's talk about New Zealand. It's completely different here, same people, but we look the same, but definitely don't act the same.
Right.
And you instantly just had the EQ, enough to be able to just have a bit of a laugh and take the piss out of yourself. And, it was good.
Yeah, no, I had that same thing, that kind of kinship just really hit easy. Yeah. So you put me in touch with Ariga Martin, who was founding a company called Trove, where she was CEO, or I don't know exactly what titles and roles were at that point, but she was running the show. And then had a conversation with her, and she moved really, really fast. And they made me an offer, and we were at that point deciding our kids are in school, they're not going to finish until May or whatever it is. So this was October, or actually this was probably closer to August. We were in the early stages of it, and made the decision that we were just going to jump at it, and why wait kind of a thing. And thank goodness, because it ended up being COVID, right? So we wouldn't have ever gotten over. In the meantime, my daughter was diagnosed with something called chronic recurrent multifocal osteomyelitis, which is she had just been kind of complaining like, God, my foot hurts. And we're like, well, yeah, you're a kid, you fall over a lot, and I get it. You're always injured, and it wasn't getting any better. So we ended up brought her in, got some X-rays done. They're like, can't see anything. Meanwhile, the date to move over here is getting closer and closer and closer. And we now at this point are starting to get a little bit worried. And they said, well, we're going to drill into the bone, just kind of make sure it's not bone cancer. I'm like, whoa, hold on a second. Yeah. This is change of pace for where we were heading a moment ago. And they came back and they said, it's this thing, CRMO. And they said, it's about 1 out of 1 million kids gets it. And I'm like, wow. How many people live in New Zealand? 5 million?
Yeah.
So had a conversation with the doctor in America and said, what would you do? Like, as a mother, take the doctor hat off. What would you do? And she's like, I think I'd get on that plane. So he said, okay, and then got on the plane and got over here. And at that point, my daughter...
Did Immigration New Zealand know? Because they're pretty sometimes horrible about rejecting visas.
Yeah.
I also know a guy, you probably know the same guy who worked at Netflix in their data science team, whose daughter had kidney transplant, and he couldn't move to New Zealand because of that. Yeah.
They were aware. Forsyth Barr, who's the parent company of Trove, was really, really good about it. And they said, we'll make you an employee. Maybe we can help them because we've got some insurance and stuff. It didn't end up working out because it's a pre-existing condition, but real credit to them for trying to think outside of the box. How can we make this easier for everybody, kind of a thing. So she came over, and at this point, we're still trying to dial in, like, how do you even address something like this? And she can hardly walk, so she's kind of pulling herself along on the floor. It's just heartbreaking, from a parent standpoint, to see your kid in pain and to not know how to treat that is really, really challenging. So long story long, we end up getting that dialed in. Trove is becoming kind of, its own thing, and I'm bringing a lot of stuff in-house and building out a team. She's getting into school. My boy is getting into school. And all that stuff just kind of starts falling into place. But there was a bunch of, like, all at the last second, just here's a bunch of shit you got to deal with in the next, like, month and a half to be able to get on this plane. Wouldn't change it for anything. Like, it's, and she's a rock star. Like, she's the strongest human I know. Yeah, I never complain. If she hears it, she's going to be really upset that I talked about it. It's like, why'd you call that out? Like, I'm a normal kid. Like, you're not normal, but... that has nothing to do with your CRMO. And now she's like a red belt in Taekwondo. Like, she's, awesome. Dialed it in. Yeah. So, and a tough kid. But I guess the reason I'm going through all of this stuff is that entire journey was nothing more than a bunch of steps through the adjacent possibles. And I think there's a book by Eric Johnson who it's called Where Good Ideas Come From. And that's where I was introduced to this concept of it. And the way he explained it was, imagine that we have gone to a house that you've never seen before. And you walk in the first door, and there's 4 doors from the second room that you go into. Those doors weren't possible for you to walk into before you stepped into the house. And each room that you walk into, there's more doors that are presented. And I think there's something really cool about thinking about the opportunities that present themselves to us. Like, I met you because I met Troy, because I met some guy who took a job at Apple. If he hadn't taken that job at Apple, I would have never met Ed. I would have never met you. I would have never met Arga, and I would have never landed here. So, I encourage folks who are at different points in their careers to take more of those chances and just go, where might this lead? Because it's never a straight line. It certainly wasn't from the shitty university that I struggled to get through to a point that
if you weren't working in that bar, if you weren't working in that. And I think about this a lot, right? So sliding door moments, if you could, like, you're a big data guy, right? Like Ed actually, so Ed Baker, who at needles.io, I think it is. He does a lot of cool stuff with data viz, like, in terms of just things that he's interested in. He puts them online occasionally, and this is why the traffic's bad, and this is why this. And so I love that sort of stuff, just because interesting stuff I wouldn't have thought about with the consumption of data. But so we're thinking about the data of decision making every day that we have to go through, and if we're looking at it as an overview of your life and saying, all right, this is what happened with this decision, this is where it could have gone, and the likes. Fascinating where your life could take you, right?
Like, I love that.
So many different decisions that I could have taken in my life. But like, really, really interesting. And I think most people, a lot of people I talk to, especially in my industry in recruitment, I'll say to them, what's the worst that could happen if you have a chat with so-and-so? And they're like, oh, I don't know. And I'm like, worst case scenario, like you've got a friend or a network or, something there. And then they meet them and they're like, oh man, now we're like friends and do this and do that. And I'm like, just start saying yes more, right?
Yeah, just say yes more. I like that a lot.
So what was the book?
It was called Where Good Ideas Come From.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's cool. It's like I tend to think about that even in the way that we think about the products and the businesses that we're building.
Yeah.
The faster we can get these things out the door, the more we're going to be able to let them find their own adjacent possibles. If that makes any sense and isn't too really corny, and I know it is. But you don't know what these products look like. Like we've got these ideas, and I get it. And I'm a big like Apple Steve Jobs is fascinating reads, and he has that idea of I don't ask customers what they want. I tell them what it is they want because they don't really know, right?
Yeah.
Like the old, if you would have asked Ford what to build, he would have said a faster horse. Or, ask customers. And I think that there is very much like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth because cannabis product didn't exactly work because I didn't ask the customers what they wanted. At the same time, I wanted to get that out there so it could start to find its adjacent possibles a little bit. I'm not convinced it wouldn't have, but I'm never like I don't know.
So it sounds like what that AI thing that you're trying to do, like ChatGPT now, right? Like, so we can talk about, like, you feed that a bunch of code, and it's going to multilingual code for you, right?
Absolutely.
So it's right product, wrong time, and so
Yep. It's funny, speaking of ChatGPT, and I think probably everybody has been talking too much about it and is bored with it, but I will say I write a lot, and I find it really easy, really long. Like, it's just, a lot of people will say, hey, way to put 1,000 words what you could have put in 100. Like, hey, you win. But I fed ChatGPT some of my writing one day, and I said, so I want you to use my voice and write something on whatever the subject is. And it came back and it said, you're wordy and really sarcastic. I made the attempt like, that thing is a little bit too accurate.
You could have told me. I would have been able to tell you that in 10 seconds. I know. I always loved, like, whenever I sent you a CV of a candidate in the past that got an interview, I would always get really good detailed feedback. And as a recruiter, you're like constantly like, just give me feedback. Like, I don't care if they got the job or didn't get the job. I want to be able to give them some constructive feedback moving on, right? And you were always really good with that.
Well, Caitlin Smallwood, who I will name drop, she was fantastic. I worked for her at Netflix. When I got my manager position when I was there, she said to me, okay, so now you're in management. Your number one responsibility is talent. Your number two responsibility is talent. Your number three responsibility is talent. And fourth, I want you to do your normal job. And I've always believed and reinforce this with whenever I'm at work is this is our number one responsibility here is talent acquisition and talent retention. We need to think about these things through the lens of talent density always. If somebody leaves the organization and your talent density goes up, if you've got a chance to bring somebody in and they're going to raise the talent density, you got to go hard at it. And when you're partnering with somebody like Talent Army, how are we supposed to make you effective when we're not telling you what it is we're looking for? You know, so I think it's really important that yes, I could have done it in less words, but it's really important to see that partnership because that's the investment we're making.
Yeah.
It's not me writing the code anymore. I'm lifted on the shoulders of the people who are actually doing the job. So it's really important that the butts and seats that we put are the best ones we can possibly have. And I think I'm very, very proud of what the teams at Trove are. There's a wealth of talent at that organization. Trove and Forsyth Barr for the influence that we've been able to have there. Just some really, really cool stuff. So I'm very proud of that.
Good people, man. Good people. So you mentioned this at the start of the podcast, and I want to bring it back to your attention. We're talking about how do we lift the industry in terms of getting people into work. You mentioned we had a beer one night and just solved all the world's problems over a couple of beers. You mentioned you're really passionate about getting more women into data and more multi into data and like just finding opportunities where they could find their way into it.
Yeah.
Like, how do you think we can do this? Like,
yeah, I think there's two components. So the first one is on inroads. So how do we give exit ramps to folks who are maybe coming out of, let's use women as an example. You've left the workforce, you're spent 5 years, and now your child is ready for ready for kindy, and you don't want to go be the insurance agent that you were. Like, we have to have people have exit ramps that allow them, or on-ramps, I guess, that would allow them roles in technology that don't require a computer science degree. You had mentioned before when I was talking about my own journey, and you said, how did you get past the Netflix interview with your shitty university? I don't care about where anybody goes to school at the end of the day, right? Like, I'm looking for people who are good problem solvers.
Neither do I, but the reason why I brought that up is because it only came to my attention probably 3 hours ago. A good friend of mine lost his job in the States. Super talented, like super, super talented. Went through the process at one of these companies that we talked about before. What did you say, Fink, was it?
Fink.
Yeah. Got the job offer, and then they found out that he didn't attend university and rescinded the job offer.
That's
and
horrible.
Yeah, like one of the most talented people I've ever met, and rescinded the job offer. And I was like, how can you even do that? You know, and based off that he didn't have a university degree.
They avoided a bad situation. Anybody who's looking at it through that lens,
I'm with you. I don't even read that on a CV, to be honest. Like, if a client ever came to me after I'd sent them a CV of a candidate and said, yeah, what university did they go to? I'd be like, well, what the fuck? Who cares?
Right. Yep. The only time it matters for me is if I'm hiring somebody who's brand new.
Grads,
so that I
interns,
can see,
right? Yeah.
Like, they're trainable.
Yeah.
Beyond that, I don't care.
Yeah.
So inroads, being able to provide them something where they don't need a computer science degree. It's not so much the degree part, but that that training is hard to get when you've been out of the industry for a while. So I think that's part one.
Is it dumb question here from a dumb guy? Is data more accessible to people that are scared of technology than software engineering?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I
would make that assumption.
20 years in this industry, so I'm not belittling it. Like, I don't want it to come off that way. Declarative languages are easier to learn. So SQL is an easier, more approachable language to be able to learn. And I also find that there's some people who say, maybe I'd like to be in a tech job, but I don't know which one is it. I'm left brain. Like, I'm kind of artsy side. Data visualization goes far beyond creating bar charts. Like, it's how we see the signal and the noise. I know it's, again, corny term, but that type of connection. I have a guy who works for me right now who moved out of engineering, moved into data, and I pushed him to do that in part because I think he has this beautiful artistic side, and he's got this ability to think in kind of ones and zeros, and that combination just screams data visualization and those type of things. So I think there are some ways that we can support folks as they move into that industry in that space. And the Maori space I'm super interested in. I'm going to talk out of my ass if I pretend like I know anything about it.
Yeah.
But I do know that those communities come together to be able to support that. And I feel like if we could make some inroads into those communities, that would be a really, really helpful thing that we can do, and something that, frankly, when we are in positions like we're in, we have a responsibility to do some of that stuff.
Yeah, fuck yeah. Send the elevator back down, right?
Exactly. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
I like that. The other part is, once we do bring people in, do we give them a way to move up that ladder? So inroads and then move up from there. It's like you say, I like that. Send the elevator back down. That's really cool. I like that a lot.
Yeah, I've got some Māori founders and people that work in like the Māori communities coming onto the podcast in Pacifica as well. Because of that, right? Like, we've now got, I think, probably it's an easier time for anyone to get into tech, because geographically now it's changed with remote working, and so it doesn't matter where you are now, you can find a job. But I think data, like something that people can consume, social media, they're getting their heads around now, and they can sort of let these people start looking at the analytics of social media and the likes, and so I think there's something cool that you could do there.
I like that a lot.
So you're now, right, CTO of this company. How is it as a CTO as a builder, when you stop building and you sit in meetings?
Great question. I am still building. I still build teams. I'm going to date myself a little bit on this.
We already did, man, with kicks.
I had a book called The Mythical Man Month, which is I don't know, from maybe the 70s or something like that. And I read it when I first got into technology. And there is a story that the author tells in it. And he says, if you have ever stood on the floor of the Sistine Chapel and looked up, he says, you know that this church took decades, maybe hundreds of years to build. And that means that architects came and went. But if you stand on the floor and look up, you can't see where one architect died and the next one started. And that is a characteristic that is very similar to software engineering. So when I came over here and made the decision to move away from what I lovingly call the Wellington reference architecture, which is Ruby on Rails sitting in, some microservices monolith with a couple hundred RESTful APIs and a Postgres RDBMS sitting behind it.
Yep. Half my
all
clients.
over the place. I made the decision that I wanted to take that's the right word, a more modern approach, maybe.
Yep.
Serverless, wide key value stores. I can give single-digit millisecond response times with DynamoDB. I don't have to worry about VPCs and subnets and internet gateways and read replicas and failovers and multi-reach. And I can get rid of all of that stuff and simplify that architecture. So I made that decision that we were going to move into that. It's a hard tech to find right now in New Zealand. I think
people.
When you and I are talking in 10 years, we're having a different story. I went up to Auckland one day to do, this is our architecture with AWS, do their load segments that they have. And that was what their comments were, this is awesome. We really want this coming to New Zealand. We're not finding a whole bunch of it. So my role as CTO within Trove has been part doing the meeting thing that you're calling out. It's also been to be that architect that sits across for that technology stack and help these folks kind of, start to be able to do those things on their own, be able to make those technical decisions that they need to make. So I have been able to continue to design those things. I have a designer that I work with whose name is Maya Wisnowski, who deserves every call out that she gets. She's absolutely fantastic. But being able to partner with somebody of her level as she's kind of building out what those front ends look like, and then to be able to bring that architectural and solution architecture kind of mindset to how we're going to implement that stuff in the background has allowed me to continue to build on some level. I don't line up the ones and the zeros anymore, and I haven't for a while outside of, when I'm doing it at my house, but I still kind of scratch that itch that way. And that's, the next role I find is going to do the same kind of a thing. I can't get away from it. It's in my DNA,
So you must have been really fucked off when they didn't legalize marijuana here. You've been like, I've got a product ready to go, guys. I think it'd be more receptive here, right? That product.
Yeah. Well, it would be federal, just like Canada, right? Yeah. So the payment situation would be addressed. But I think, that building a recommendation engine, so using data and building up those type of things, that's so applicable to so many different things. So building that product wasn't a failure. It just didn't sell.
Would you allow people to share the account though?
To share the account? Right.
For those that don't get that joke, that's the Netflix account sharing that's being stopped. Yeah. So do you look back at your companies now and see if you've played critical roles, do you look back fondly and sort of see the part that you played and look at the products that you've been influential on? And
yeah, I think I reflect a lot about all the mistakes that I made on it. Yep. I think a lot of people who have had success fear failure more than they're embracing the success of things. And I think I'm pretty critical when I look back on some of the mistakes. Talked about the company that I had in Portland where product and data mishandled a number of things on that front. If I could turn back the clock 3 years ago and done all of Trove over, a number of things that I would do differently.
I think that's like anyone that's super talented, right? Like I've got tattoos, for those that aren't watching right now that I'm referencing. Every time I go and see my tattooist, he's like, oh, I hate that last one I did on you. I could have done that better. And I'm like, well, don't fucking tell me that, right? Right. It's on my body. But I get your creative mind and how it works. He's constantly wanting to evolve and the likes. Yeah. But I think you've, that's just naturally how people are going to be. But you always have to go, think about the highs, right?
Yeah. I think I tend to focus on fixing the things that I could do better. I think there's something really interesting being a technical guy. The first time you do in architecture, you spend the entire time thinking about, next time I'm going to do this, that, and the other. Yeah. The second time you do it, you add all those bells and whistles, and it becomes this Frankenstein of nobody can maintain this. It's got all this shit that you don't need. And then the third time you kind of do it right. I'm in those cycles of figuring out the next time I do this and the next time I do this, I've got,
Would you do the same tech stack again?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, that's
absolutely.
That's a pro and a con, right? That's such a great modern tech stack, but it's also a con that it's hard to find people with that experience. But
it's funny. I was talking to a CTO of a different fintech app not too long ago, and I said, "What's your tech stack?" And he said, "Oh, it's Ruby on Rails and Postgres." And I said, "Oh, that's the well-engine reference architecture." I said, "Why did you make that choice? Because you don't seem like you're really tied to it." And he goes, "Because I can find people. Like I've got a talent pool for it." And I support that. My take on it is when I go a different route, I find people who are excited about learning something new, and it changes the devs that I'm able to get my hands on because of that. Like, devs have a tendency to chase the kind of shiny object kind of a thing. To be able to see that this is the right, in my opinion, the right technology to fix this problem or to address this problem allowed me to get in touch with some really, really strong devs. And I mean, a number of them come through from Telenar. I mean, you've said a couple of times, like, this is a really strong dev. They have a lot of they've had a lot of success and stuff. The right devs for me are the ones who are attracted to that, who really want to push themselves and go, I have no idea what you're talking about, but I want to try this GraphQL thing.
Yeah.
Or, I want to do an event-driven architecture.
They're the ones I interview, right? Like you can tell straight away. I'll interview someone, and I always like to start off with a really open-ended, shitty question because it pretty much gives me the fodder for the rest of the interview that I'm going to do, right? Which is, what's your ideal role and why? And then they'll go, oh, and then the ones that go straight into, I want to build a product that does this and that and doesn't mention tech stack. I'm like, cool, and what would you build it in? They're like, I don't know, but it doesn't matter, and I'm like, hey, cool, I got you. Yeah, and so.
And you're hitting on something I think that I wish I was finding more of is those engineers who are just really product thinkers.
Yeah.
They really have that kind of Steve Jobs mentality of like, I don't really give a shit what's under the covers on this thing. I want it to be cool and I want it to be pure, but it's really about delivering a product.
Yeah.
And the technology is a product. Like if you're doing it right, it should be reusable. All the things. So I think it finds the right people, and I think that. The advice that I would give to younger me would have been allow yourself the ability to go deep on each of those things, because whether or not you believe in the 10,000 hours thing or not, you have so many things that you can go deep on. Like that was really poorly said. There's two books. There is Range, Epstein's Range, who says the world needs more generalists, and I agree with that. And then there's
Jeffrey Epstein.
Not Jeffrey, non-rapey upstream. And then there's the Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers, who says, Tiger Woods was Tiger Woods because he had golfed 10,000 hours by the time he was 6 or whatever it was. And a lot of folks, I think, see those as contradictions. I see Range, this idea of being a generalist, as a set of going deep on a whole bunch of different things. So I'm 50, I've got about 15 years left. I can go deep and reinvent myself 3 more times. I can become an expert in 3 new things that I've never been a part of. And I think if we think of our careers in terms of being able to become generalists of things that we're really deep in, I think those adjacent possibles are amazing. So I would tell my younger self to embrace that more. And the other thing I would tell them is go work at startups.
Yeah.
Like absolutely go work at startups. What I, was running away from at City and didn't realize it, I was running towards, I want to know more about the business side. I want to know more about what do the designers do. I want to know more about what do the researchers do. Like how do all these pieces fit together? You don't ever get to learn that stuff working at Blue Cross or City or Chase or, these big organizations. I can't speak for Xero or some of the bigger organizations that are in New Zealand, so I won't, but I can say those like a big American companies do nothing for me. Like leave those for McKinsey's and Yahoo's like that. Like I love what startups can bring, and I think more young people need to get into startups and make that choice. Don't look at the dollars, look at the opportunity that you're going to gain by doing it. And for those younger people, make sure that those startups can provide you the support to be successful. Don't just go to them because they want to hire interns.
Yeah.
And I tend to at Trove, I don't hire interns. I steer clear of juniors, not because I don't love them, but because I just don't know that I can support them the right way.
Yeah, you're not ready as a company. And I think that's important, right? You need to, you can't adhere to social pressure of, you should hire interns if you can't support them, right? And so, like, I'm not sure if you heard Mickey's podcast. Actually, you probably didn't because it only came out today.
Okay, no, I haven't.
Yeah, and so he talked about how they did their whole grad program and how it was really successful, but then they realized, holy shit, we don't have the people to support them, and had to go back and re-engineer it all over again. And so,
that's exactly right.
So I've always really loved working with you in terms of, you know exactly what you want, you know the type of person you're looking for, and you know it when you see it. And so I want to ask you this question with two sides of the coin, right? So how would you teach someone to know what you're looking for? Like, when you're trying to find someone good, talk me through your process of how you know that person's good and how you evaluate them. And then on the opposite side, right? Like, if you're looking to go and join a startup, how do you know if that startup's good? How would you sort of address someone that, or give someone the information there?
Yeah. So I think at the end of the day, we can do a whole bunch of things when it comes to talent and still get it wrong a lot. So grain of salt with this. That said, I think New Zealand is really interesting in that there are a number of labor laws that protect employees, and I think that is absolutely fantastic. I think too often it doesn't work out the right way, and the way that it is dealt with isn't the way it would be dealt with in America.
You're talking about, for example, like if I wasn't performing, you can just pay me out in America and say, all the best, good luck.
Yep. And I think anytime we have somebody who's not performing and you have to make that decision, they know it.
Yeah.
On both sides of the table know it. So it's almost clarity to be able to just have that conversation and address it that way. What happens, I think, too often in New Zealand is we end up knowing how hard it is to address that situation, and the response to it is, whether consciously or subconsciously, you end up treating the person like shit until they walk out the door themselves. And that's really, really unfortunate.
And it affects a lot of people in the business because of that, right?
Absolutely. Yep. So I think that it is absolutely vital that people take this really, really seriously and put together or approach it in terms of, this is a relationship that we're both entering into. So when I'm talking to the folks that I'm interviewing, or that we're interviewing internally, as I say, this is a two-way. Like, this is a two-way thing. If they're going to have 45 minutes with them, 22 and a half of those minutes, they should be talking, in 22 and a half, like, they should be interviewing you. Like, it's got to go both ways. I do feel like there is some gut there. I feel like I want to see people who are asking me as many questions as I'm asking them. I want to see people who are going to disagree with me. I'll often say, all right, I'm going to give you a topic and you can pick which side, and I'm going to argue the other side, mostly just because I want to see how they're going to react to that. That's a really big one. The other one for me is I don't care about the language. Like, if I find smart people who problem solve the way I identify problem solving to be effective, that's really the key for me. So that's how I identify that one. We will talk about things that have nothing to do with lining up ones and zeros. So that's that one. The one from me, when I'm evaluating a place, it's almost completely on culture at this point. Like, do I like the product, and are these the type of people who are going to help me to be the best me and be able to play the role that I want to play in it. So I don't worry too much about the tech stack and some of that stuff. I will say, for me at this point in my career, I kind of need to be a founder. I don't believe in autonomous collectives for organizations. I think it's a great punchline in a Monty Python movie, but I don't think it works to run a company. At the end of the day, you got to make decisions, and I think it's easier when there's when I get to make the ones that I want to make. So let's call it a personality flaw, but that's a big one for me. I want to be a founder again.
Take the American out of America.
Right.
Awesome, man. Well, this has been a really enjoyable chat, Joel. I've really enjoyed it, and
Are we recording now?
Yeah, we're just starting to roll now. So I could chat for another 2 hours on this. This has been fascinating, but we are at our time, and so I'll ask you the question that I sort of finalise with everyone, which I've been told from the people that are more technical challenged, they find this really easy. The people that aren't technical find this really hard, which I find it interesting. Maybe we could do some sort of data viz on that.
Right.
But what makes you happy?
I love the Orcas Island. I absolutely love crabbing.
Yeah.
And I used to go kind of twice a year. There's a place on Orcas Island, which is the San Juan Islands, Puget Sound, Washington, kind of near Vancouver, Canada, and bring the kayaks up there, floating in the mornings. The cabins have, just a fireplace to heat them, no Wi-Fi. So I bring a bunch of books and kayak and crab all day and hopefully see an orca jump, and I'm in heaven. I absolutely love it.
That sounds like Nevada to me.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
I just spent a week in Perth, and I was getting up every morning, going for a jet ski or a canoe on the water. I read so many books, listened to so many podcasts. I finish work every day at midday because I work New Zealand hours, and so fantastic. That's Bill Gates has got it right when he takes his books to his cabin for a while, and man.
Yep, I love it.
Awesome, buddy. All right, well, I'll leave you to it. Hopefully, you're going back out to some canoe place now in New Zealand, and you're going to sit down and enjoy that moment. But thanks so much for coming on.
The weather might not be great right now, but
yeah. Oh, indeed.
I tell you, I'm absolutely humbled to get the invitation. I really, really appreciate it. So thank you for this.
Awesome, mate.
Cool.
Thank you. Well, I hope that you're in a cabin right now after finishing crabbing for the day. You've been out in your canoe and you thought, I'll put that podcast on because I've subscribed to the We Fucking Love Startups podcast. And so thank you for doing that. And then now you've shared it across the platforms because you want other people to come in and listen, and we want those people to subscribe. So thank you very much to Joel, and thank you for everyone that's subscribing and that's about to subscribe. Until next time.
This podcast is produced by John Otaka from Empire Films.